name is Sarah Mitchell, and on a gray October evening in Bellevue, Washington, I learned that sometimes the people who know you least are the ones who share your DNA. I was sitting at my father's 61st birthday dinner, watching him carve prime rib, while my mother fussed over crystal wine glasses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The dining room overlooked Lake Washington, where million-dollar yachts bobbed like toys in the distance, and everything around me screamed success. Everything except me. My brother Ryan raised his glass of vintage Bordeaux, his MBA from Wharton, gleaming as brightly as his gold watch. "To Dad," he announced, his voice carrying the confident boom of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. 61 years of building an empire that will stand for generations. The words hit differently when you're the generation that apparently doesn't count. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The conversation that followed felt like watching a movie about someone else's life. Ryan dominated the table with talk of the newest luxury development project, dropping numbers that made my mother beam with pride. 42 units, each starting at $2.8 million, pre-sales already at 60%. The kind of project that put Mitchell Development Group on the map alongside Seattle's biggest players. My father nodded along, occasionally interjecting with stories about his own real estate conquests, painting himself as the visionary who'd taken his father's small company and turned it into a Pacific Northwest powerhouse. I picked at my food, knowing I was invisible at my own family's celebration. They had no idea that my little nonprofit work, as they called it, had just secured a $15 million federal grant to transform Portland's most challenging neighborhood into a mixed-income community that would house over 300 families. They didn't know that the urban renewal project I'd spent 3 years building was being studied by city planners from Los Angeles to Boston. To them, I was still the daughter who'd chosen social work over serious business, the one who lived in a modest apartment and drove a 4-year-old Honda instead of embracing the luxury that our family name could provide. My mother's voice cut through my thoughts like a blade wrapped in silk. "Sarah, sweetheart, you've been so quiet tonight. How are things at your little community center?" The question wasn't asked with genuine interest, but with the tone someone might use when asking about a child's lemonade stand. Sweet, but ultimately inconsequential. Before I could answer, Ryan leaned back in his chair with that smirk I'd learned to hate over the years. "Speaking of community work, Dad, you should see the latest neighborhood Sarah's trying to save. I drove through there last week when I was looking at some commercial properties in Portland. It's rough. Real rough. I mean, I get that she wants to help people, but there's a difference between charity work and throwing good money after bad." The dismissal in his voice was casual, effortless. He had no idea that the rough neighborhood he'd driven through was the same one where I'd spent countless nights in community meetings, listening to single mothers talk about their dreams of homeownership, working with local business owners to create job training programs, partnering with developers who understood that profit and purpose didn't have to be mutually exclusive. He saw blight. I saw potential. My father set down his fork and fixed me with that look I'd known since childhood. The look that said he was about to deliver wisdom whether I wanted it or not. "You know, Sarah, your grandfather always used to say that business is about solving problems, but you have to solve problems that people are willing to pay for. This community development work you're doing, it's admirable, but it's not sustainable. It's not building anything that lasts." The irony was suffocating. My grandfather, Frank Mitchell, had started this company by building affordable housing for working families in the 1970s. He'd built a business on the principle that everyone deserved a decent place to live, that development could strengthen communities instead of displacing them. But somehow, in the decades since his death 5 years ago, that legacy had been rewritten. Now it was all about luxury towers and maximum profit margins. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of pity that felt worse than outright hostility. "We just worry about your future, dear. You're almost 30, and you're still renting that little apartment. Ryan was already a homeowner by your age, and now look at him. He's got the house in Medina, the cabin in Whistler, a portfolio that keeps growing. We want that security for you too." Security. As if security could only be measured in square footage and stock options. As if the work I was doing, the families I was helping achieve homeownership for the first time in their lives, the small businesses I was helping launch, somehow didn't count as real accomplishments because they couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. Ryan's wife Brittany, who'd been mostly silent through dinner, chose that moment to twist the knife a little deeper. "I've been telling Ryan we should set Sarah up with someone from the firm. There are some really successful guys there who might be able to help her see the bigger picture. Sometimes you need someone to show you what's possible when you think bigger." Think bigger. I almost laughed. If they only knew how big I was actually thinking. The final blow came when my father stood to make his traditional birthday speech. He always did this, holding court like a king, addressing his subjects, reflecting on the year past and the year ahead. This time, his words felt like a door slamming shut. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," he began, his voice taking on that philosophical tone he used when he wanted to sound profound. "About what we build and what we pass down. Ryan, you've shown this year that you understand what it means to carry on the Mitchell name. The Eastgate project, the expansion into Vancouver, the partnerships you've built. You get it. You understand that family businesses aren't just about blood, they're about vision and capability." He raised his glass toward Ryan, then let his eyes drift toward me for just a moment. "Some people are builders, and some people are, well, they find their own paths. Both have value, but only one builds dynasties." The message was crystal clear. Ryan was the heir. I was the afterthought. That night I drove the 2.5 hours back to Portland, in complete silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel as the familiar landscape of Interstate 5 blurred past in the darkness. No music, no podcasts, no distractions. Just the hum of tires on asphalt and the crystalline clarity that sometimes comes when you finally stop lying to yourself about who people really are. The rain had started just as I crossed the Columbia River. Typical October weather that matched the storm building inside my chest. By the time I pulled into my parking spot outside my Pearl District apartment, the precipitation was coming down in sheets, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected neon. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, engine off, watching the water cascade down my windshield and letting the full weight of the evening settle into my bones. The decision formed slowly, like ice crystallizing on a window. It wasn't born from anger, though anger was certainly there. It wasn't even born from hurt, though the hurt was a living thing that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in my ribcage. It was born from something colder and more dangerous than either of those emotions. It was born from absolute, unshakable certainty. I was done. Not done with my work. Not done with my life. Not done with building something meaningful in this world. I was done being the Mitchell family disappointment. I was done accepting their scraps of conditional affection. I was done pretending that their version of success was the only version that mattered. Most importantly, I was done believing that their inability to see my value had anything to do with my actual worth. The rain continued to hammer against the metal roof of my Honda as I made a promise to myself. Never again would I sit at their table and allow them to make me feel small. Never again would I seek their approval for choices that had already proven their merit in the real world. And never again would I let them rewrite the legacy of a man who had understood that true wealth wasn't measured solely in dollars and cents. My grandfather Frank would have been proud of what I was building. The man who started Mitchell Development Group in a cramped office above a donut shop, who spent his first decade creating affordable housing for Boeing workers and Microsoft employees, before either company became household names, who believed that development should strengthen communities rather than displace them. But Frank Mitchell had been dead for 5 years, and with him had died any hope that his original vision would survive in a company now obsessed with luxury and profit margins. Walking up the 3 flights to my apartment, water dripping from my coat onto the hardwood floors, I began to understand that this evening hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the final note in a symphony of dismissal that had been playing for most of my adult life. The pattern was so clear now that I wondered how I had ever missed it. The apartment I unlocked was modest by Mitchell family standards, but it was mine. Exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River, furniture I'd chosen myself rather than inherited from someone else's idea of good taste. The space reflected who I actually was, rather than who someone else thought I should be. I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle that cost $12 instead of $200, and settled into my reading chair to let the memories come. There was the Christmas morning when I was 23, fresh out of graduate school with a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Washington. I had been so proud of that degree, earned while working 2 part-time jobs to avoid asking my family for money, completed with a thesis on sustainable community development that my professors called groundbreaking. The morning I presented my diploma to my parents, still in its ceremonial folder, my father had glanced at it briefly before setting it aside to examine Ryan's new Tag Heuer watch. Urban planning, he had mused as if the words tasted strange in his mouth. I suppose someone has to figure out where to put the poor people. The dismissal had been casual, effortless. Ryan had laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of their Lake Washington home. "At least it's not as useless as an art history degree," he had said, earning approving chuckles from assembled relatives. No one had asked about my plans or my passion for the field. No one had inquired about the internship I had already secured with a Portland nonprofit. The conversation had moved on to Ryan's latest promotion at the family company, his expanding responsibilities, his obvious preparation for eventual leadership. That diploma had ended up in my childhood bedroom, tucked into a desk drawer beneath old birthday cards and school certificates. It stayed there until I moved out permanently, and when I finally retrieved it 2 years later, the folder was slightly faded from being buried under papers no one had bothered to move. Then there was the family vacation to Hawaii the summer I turned 25. I had just completed my first major project, transforming a struggling strip mall in southeast Portland into a mixed-use space that housed a community health clinic, a job training center, and affordable artist studios. The project had won a statewide award for innovative community development and had been featured in planning magazines across the country. I had been excited to share this success with my family, to finally have something that might earn their respect. Instead, the entire week had... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Been devoted to celebrating Ryan's engagement to Brittany. Every conversation revolved around wedding plans, guest lists, venue selections. When I tried to mention my award, my mother had smiled briefly and then launched into a detailed discussion about flower arrangements. When I attempted to explain how the project was already being replicated in 3 other cities, my father had nodded absently while reading stock reports on his phone. The award certificate remained in my luggage for the entire trip, never making it out of my suitcase. But perhaps the most telling incident had occurred just 2 years ago, when I was invited to speak at a national conference on urban renewal strategies. The invitation had come from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, recognizing my work on what they called a revolutionary approach to community-centered development. I was one of only 12 speakers selected from across the country, and at 27, I was by far the youngest. I had called my parents to share the news, genuinely excited for the first time in years about the possibility of their pride. The conference was being held in Seattle, practically in their backyard. Surely this time would be different. Surely this achievement was significant enough to warrant their attention. My mother had answered the phone, and I could hear the sounds of one of their dinner parties in the background. Important clients, no doubt, or potential investors in Ryan's latest project. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she had said when I finished explaining about the conference. "Hold on just a moment." Then, to someone in the background, "Margaret, you simply must try the salmon. The chef outdid himself tonight." When she returned to the conversation, she had forgotten what I was telling her. "What was this about a conference?" she asked, and I could hear the impatience creeping into her voice. I explained again, more briefly this time. "Well, that sounds lovely. Maybe we can get coffee while you're in town, if our schedule permits. Ryan has a big presentation that week for the Kirkland Waterfront project. They never came to the conference. They never asked how it went. Ryan's presentation, as it turned out, had been routine quarterly results delivered to investors they had been courting for months. Standard business practice, nothing groundbreaking or innovative. But it had somehow taken precedence over their daughter being recognized as a national expert in her field. The wine glass grew warm in my hands as I sat in my quiet apartment, watching the lights of Portland shimmer through rain-streaked windows. Each memory felt like pulling a splinter from skin that had grown around it, painful but necessary. I was beginning to understand that their inability to see my achievements wasn't an oversight or a misunderstanding, it was a choice. They had decided long ago who I was allowed to be in their family narrative. The dreamer. The idealist. The one who chose passion over profit, meaning over money. They had cast me in the role of family disappointment so thoroughly that any evidence to the contrary simply didn't register. My successes had to be minimized or ignored entirely because acknowledging them would require admitting that their value system wasn't the only one that mattered. But tonight felt different from all those previous disappointments. Tonight, for the first time, their dismissal felt like their loss rather than my failure. The grant I had secured, the communities I was transforming, the families I was helping achieve homeownership, the small businesses I was nurturing into success. None of that became less real because my father couldn't see it. None of it became less valuable because my brother couldn't understand it. I pulled out my laptop and opened the folder where I kept updates on my current projects. 37 families had moved into affordable homes I had helped develop in the past 18 months. The job training center I had established was graduating its third class of certified electricians and plumbers, with a 93% placement rate in good-paying union jobs. The small business incubator I had created was housing 12 local entrepreneurs, half of them women, most of them people of color, who had been denied traditional business loans. The numbers told a story my family would never bother to hear, but they told it nonetheless. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, my former professor who had become something of a mentor over the years. Heard through the grapevine that the Portland project is being considered for the National Community Development Excellence Award. Call me tomorrow, we need to talk strategy. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something shift inside my chest. Dr. Rodriguez believed in my work. The Federal Grant Committee believed in my work. The families living in homes I had helped create believed in my work. That belief didn't require my father's approval to be valid. The rain was finally beginning to slow outside my windows, and through the clearing clouds, I could see stars emerging over the Willamette River. For the first time in hours, I smiled. Tomorrow, I would call Dr. Rodriguez. Tomorrow, I would continue building something my grandfather would have been proud of. And tomorrow, I would begin the process of showing my family exactly what they had chosen not to see. The morning after my father's birthday dinner, I woke up in my Portland apartment with the kind of clarity that only comes from finally accepting an uncomfortable truth. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming under pale October sunlight that streamed through my floor-to-ceiling windows. I made coffee in my small kitchen and stood looking out at the Willamette River, where early morning joggers were already making their way along the waterfront path. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But breathing freely also meant confronting the full scope of what I had been suffocating under for so long. The dinner at my father's house hadn't been an anomaly. It was simply the latest chapter in a story that had been writing itself for over a decade, a story I had been too hopeful or too naive to read clearly until now. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos, looking for evidence of a pattern I was only now beginning to recognize. There it was, captured in digital memories I had somehow managed to forget or rationalize away. Picture after picture of family gatherings where I existed on the periphery, celebrations of milestones that mattered to everyone except me, moments where the invisible nature of my place in the Mitchell family hierarchy was preserved forever in pixels. The photo from my college graduation was particularly telling. There I stood in my cap and gown, diploma in hand, summa cum laude honors cord draped around my neck. But the composition of the image told the real story. Ryan dominated the center of the frame, his arm around our father, both of them beaming with pride. Not pride in my achievement, but pride in Ryan's new promotion to regional sales manager at Mitchell Development Group, announced that same weekend. I was positioned at the edge of the group, my accomplishment literally and figuratively marginalized. I remembered that day with painful precision now. My graduation had been scheduled for Saturday morning, a beautiful June day on the University of Washington campus. The ceremony itself had been moving, with the dean specifically mentioning my thesis on sustainable community development as an example of student work that would shape the future of urban planning. I had felt genuinely proud as I walked across that stage, knowing that I had earned every honor through years of work that had often left me exhausted but never left me empty. But the celebration afterward had quickly become about Ryan's news. Over lunch at an expensive seafood restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay, my father had raised his glass in a toast that I initially thought was meant for me. Instead, he had begun speaking about Ryan's promotion, about how proud he was to see his son taking on greater responsibilities in the family business, about the bright, in my direction during the meal, offering those small, tight smiles that were supposed to convey inclusion but somehow managed to do the opposite. When the waiter had asked if we were celebrating anything special, she had gestured toward Ryan. "Our son just received a wonderful promotion," she had said, as if I weren't sitting right there with a diploma that represented 4 years of academic excellence. The pattern extended far beyond graduation ceremonies and birthday dinners. There was the Christmas when I was 24, when I had finally saved enough money to buy my parents thoughtful, meaningful gifts. For my father, I had commissioned a local artist to create a watercolor painting of the first apartment building his father had ever constructed, the modest complex in Ballard that had launched Mitchell Development Group. For my mother, I had put together a photo album documenting 3 generations of Mitchell family history, complete with newspaper clippings about my grandfather's early projects and their positive impact on Seattle's growing working-class population. I had spent weeks researching and assembling these gifts, driven by some naive belief that honoring our family's real history might help bridge the gap between my values and theirs. The painting had been expensive enough to strain my graduate school budget, but I had thought it would mean something to my father to see his family's humble beginnings transformed into art. Ryan, meanwhile, had purchased his gifts during a single lunch hour at an upscale department store in downtown Seattle. Generic luxury items with impressive price tags but no personal thought behind them. A cashmere scarf for our mother from a brand she had specifically mentioned wanting. A bottle of aged scotch for our father from a distillery he had visited during a business trip to Scotland. On Christmas morning, the difference in reception had been stark and immediate. My mother had unwrapped Ryan's scarf with genuine delight, immediately putting it on and admiring herself in the mirror above the fireplace. My father had opened the scotch with obvious pleasure, already planning when he would break it out for important clients. Both gifts had prompted stories about how thoughtful Ryan was, how well he understood their tastes, how fortunate they were to have a son who paid such careful attention to their preferences. When my father had unwrapped the watercolor painting, he had stared at it for several long seconds with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This is the Ballard project," he had said finally, his voice flat and somewhat puzzled. "Why would you choose this one?" When I had explained that it was their first development, the foundation of everything that came after, he had nodded absently and set the painting aside without another word. It had never been framed or hung anywhere in their house, as far as I knew. My mother's reaction to the photo album had been even more deflating. She had flipped through the pages quickly, pausing occasionally to comment on how young everyone looked in the old pictures or how much the city had changed since my grandfather's time. But there had been no recognition of the work I had put into assembling the collection, no appreciation for the way I had tried to honor our family's legacy. When she reached the end, she had simply closed the album and placed it on the coffee table with the other gifts that would eventually migrate to closets and storage rooms. That same Christmas, Ryan had announced his engagement to Brittany over dinner, producing a ring that had clearly cost more than I earned in 6 months. The celebration that followed had consumed the rest of the holiday, with phone calls to relatives, discussions of wedding venues, and detailed planning conversations that seemed to expand to fill every available moment. My gifts had been forgotten entirely in the excitement, and by the time I left to drive back to school, they had already disappeared into the general clutter of a house that contained too many expensive things to keep track of. But perhaps the most revealing incident had occurred 3 years ago, when I was 26 and finally ready to share something I had been working toward in secret for months. I had been selected for a prestigious fellowship program that would allow me to spend a year working with community development organizations in 5 different countries, studying innovative approaches to affordable housing and sustainable urban planning. The fellowship came with a modest stipend and, more importantly, the kind of international experience that could transform my career in community development. The selection process had been intensely competitive, requiring letters of recommendation, a detailed research proposal, and a presentation to a panel of experts in the field. When I received the acceptance letter, I had been so excited that I had immediately called my parents to share the news, certain that this time they would understand the significance of what I had achieved. My father had answered the phone during what sounded like a business dinner, with voices and clinking glasses audible in the background. When I told him about the fellowship, his response had been immediate and definitive. "A year abroad? Sarah, that's completely impractical. What about your job? What about building a real career? You can't just keep floating from one academic exercise to another forever." I had tried to explain that the fellowship was anything but academic, that it would give me hands-on experience with community development projects that were already changing lives in cities around the world. But he had cut me off before I could finish. "Listen, sweetheart, Ryan has been asking if you might want to come work for the company when you're ready to get serious about your future. Maybe we can discuss this fellowship idea after you've had some real business experience." The conversation had ended with me holding a dead phone and staring at the acceptance letter in my hand, feeling the weight of an opportunity that my own father couldn't recognize as valuable. I had eventually declined the fellowship, telling myself that I could apply again in a few years when my family might be more supportive of my decisions. But the opportunity had never come again, and I had spent the next 3 years wondering what my life might have looked like if I had been brave enough to choose my dreams over my family's approval. Ryan, meanwhile, had been celebrated that same year for completing an executive MBA program that his company had paid for, and that had required him to attend classes 1 weekend per month for 18 months. The graduation party had been held at the country club, with business associates and family friends invited to honor his commitment to professional development. No one had mentioned that I had been offered a chance to study community development innovations in Barcelona, Sao Paulo, and Mumbai, or that I had given up that chance to avoid disappointing parents who had never asked what would make me happy. Standing in my Portland apartment with my coffee growing cold in my hands, I finally understood that these incidents weren't isolated moments of thoughtlessness or poor timing. They were the building blocks of a family mythology that required my diminishment in order to sustain Ryan's elevation. In the story my parents told themselves about their children, there could only be one success, one source of pride, one heir to the Mitchell legacy. Everything else had to be relegated to supporting character status, or written out of the narrative entirely. The realization was liberating and devastating in equal measure. Liberating because it meant I could stop trying to earn something that had never been available to me in the first place. Devastating because it meant accepting that the people who should have loved me unconditionally had chosen instead to love me conditionally, and I had spent years failing to meet conditions that kept changing whenever I came close to meeting them. My phone rang, interrupting my turbase, the voice of someone who had always seen my potential clearly. "Sarah," her warm voice filled my kitchen, carrying the faint accent that reflected her childhood in Mexico City. "I hope I'm not calling too early." I wanted to follow up on my text from last night about the National Community Development Excellence Award. I smiled for the first time since dinner the previous evening. "Never too early, Dr. Rodriguez. Tell me more about this award." Dr. Rodriguez's voice carried the kind of warmth that only came from someone who genuinely cared about your success, not because it reflected well on them, but because they had invested in seeing you flourish. As she explained the details of the National Community Development Excellence Award, I found myself sinking into my reading chair, cradling the phone against my ear like a lifeline, to a world where my work actually mattered. "The selection committee has been following your Portland projects for 2 years now," she continued, her enthusiasm evident even through the phone connection. "What you've accomplished with the Jade District revitalization is exactly the kind of innovative thinking they want to recognize. You've managed to preserve the cultural identity of the neighborhood, while creating economic opportunities that benefit existing residents instead of displacing them. That's not just community development, Sarah, that's community preservation." Her words should have filled me with pride, but instead they stirred up something more complex. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp, of the last time someone in my family had shown genuine interest in my work. It had been my grandfather, Frank, and he had been dead for 5 years. I was 19 when I first told him about my plans to study urban planning. It was during one of our Sunday afternoon visits, a tradition that had started when I was small and continued even after I left for college. Every other Sunday I would drive to his modest house in the Finney Ridge neighborhood, a craftsman bungalow he had stubbornly refused to leave even after Mitchell Development Group could have afforded him something far grander. He had been sitting in his favorite chair that afternoon, the worn leather recliner positioned to catch the best light from his living room window. At 82, his hands showed the calluses and scars of a man who had started his career swinging hammers before he learned to read blueprints. But his mind remained as sharp as the day he had founded his company, with nothing but a borrowed truck and an unshakable belief that everyone deserved a decent place to live. "Urban planning," he had repeated when I explained my chosen major, rolling the words around in his mouth like he was tasting wine. "Tell me what that means to you, sweetheart." I had been nervous, unsure how to explain my passion for creating communities that worked for everyone, not just the wealthy. But something in his eyes, a genuine curiosity that I rarely saw in my father's face, had encouraged me to keep talking. I told him about my fascination with mixed-income housing developments, about my belief that affordable didn't have to mean ugly or isolated, about my dream of designing neighborhoods where children could walk safely to school, and elderly residents could age in place with dignity. When I finished, he had been quiet for several long moments, his weathered fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. Then he had reached over to the bookshelf beside him and pulled out a photograph I had never seen before. It showed a young man in work clothes, standing in front of a modest apartment building, his face beaming with pride despite the exhaustion evident in his posture. "That's me in 1973, he had said, handing me the photograph. "That building behind me was the first one I ever constructed from the ground up. 12 units, all affordable for Boeing workers and their families, nothing fancy but solid construction and fair rent." I was 28 years old, and scared out of my mind that I had taken on more than I could handle. He had pointed to details in the photograph that I never would have noticed on my own. The wide front steps designed to encourage neighbors to sit and visit with each other. The large windows that brought natural light into every unit. The small garden plots behind the building where residents could grow vegetables and flowers. Each choice had been deliberate, made by a man who understood that how people lived affected how they felt about themselves and their community. "Your father thinks I was naive in those days," my grandfather had continued, his voice carrying a note of sadness I didn't fully understand at the time. "He says sentiment doesn't pay the bills or build wealth for future generations. Maybe he's right about the wealth part, but I never built a single unit I wouldn't have been proud to live in myself. Can he say the same?" That afternoon had marked the beginning of a different kind of relationship with my grandfather, one that existed entirely separate from the rest of our family dynamics. He began sharing stories about his early projects, about the families who had lived in his buildings, about the small ways that thoughtful design could improve people's daily lives. He told me about the community center he had built in South Seattle, that still hosted after-school programs 30 years later, about the senior housing complex in Ballard, where residents had formed such strong friendships that they called it their chosen family. More importantly, he had listened to my ideas with the kind of attention that made me feel like my thoughts mattered. When I described my vision for transit-oriented development that could reduce car dependency while creating walkable neighborhoods, he had asked thoughtful questions about implementation challenges and financing models. When I shared my research on cooperative housing structures, he had pulled out a legal pad and taken notes, genuinely interested in learning about new approaches to old problems. Those Sunday afternoon conversations had continued throughout my college years, becoming the highlight of my weeks and the foundation of my confidence in my chosen field. My grandfather had been the first person to suggest that my passion for community development wasn't just idealistic dreaming but practical problem-solving that the world desperately needed. He had encouraged me to think big while staying grounded in the reality of how people actually lived their lives. But everything had changed during my senior year of college, when my grandfather's health began to decline rapidly. The man who had spent decades climbing, scaffolding, and walking construction sites was suddenly confined to a hospital bed, his body betraying the spirit that had always seemed indestructible. I visited him every day during those final weeks, watching him grow weaker while he continued to ask about my thesis project and my plans for graduate school. The last conversation we had ever shared remained burned into my memory with crystalline clarity. He had been lucid that day, more alert than he had been in weeks, and he had asked me to bring my laptop to show him the latest drafts of my thesis research. For 2 hours, we had gone through my findings about successful community development projects around the country, discussing the factors that made some initiatives thrive while others failed. "You understand something your father never learned," he had said finally, his voice barely above a whisper but still carrying the conviction that had defined his entire career. Buildings are just wood and steel and concrete until people make them into communities. The moment you forget that people are the point of everything we build, you stop being a developer and become just another landlord collecting rent. He had reached over to his bedside table and pulled out a manila envelope that looked like it had been sitting there for weeks. "I've been working on something," he had said, pressing the envelope into my hands. "Don't open it now. Wait until you graduate. But when you do open it, remember that everything worthwhile starts with someone who believes it's possible." I had promised to wait, assuming the envelope contained letters or photographs or maybe some family documents he wanted me to preserve. But 3 days later, my grandfather had died in his sleep, and in the chaos of funeral arrangements and family obligations, the envelope had gotten packed away with other personal items from his hospital room. By the time I remembered it months later, I couldn't find it among my belongings, and I had assumed it had been lost or accidentally discarded during the move back to my parents' house after graduation. The funeral itself had been a study in how differently people could interpret the same life. My father had delivered a eulogy that focused almost entirely on my grandfather's business acumen, his success in building Mitchell Development Group into a profitable enterprise, his legacy as a shrewd businessman who had provided financial security for his family. Ryan had spoken about the lessons our grandfather had taught him, about negotiation and deal-making, about the importance of maximizing return on investment. But sitting in that church pew, listening to them describe a man I barely recognized, I had realized that they had known an entirely different person than the grandfather who had shared his Sunday afternoons with me. The man they were memorializing was a successful businessman who had happened to work in real estate. The man I remembered was a community builder who had used business as a tool to create something larger than profit. In the months following his death, those differences had become even more pronounced. My father had moved quickly to modernize the company's approach, shifting focus toward higher-end developments with better profit margins. The affordable housing projects that had been my grandfather's specialty were gradually phased out in favor of luxury condominiums and upscale commercial spaces. When I had asked about continuing some of the community-focused initiatives, my father had explained patiently that sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford in an increasingly competitive market. Ryan had embraced these changes enthusiastically, seeing them as smart business evolution rather than abandonment of founding principles. He had been the one to suggest selling off the portfolio of older affordable housing complexes, arguing that the maintenance costs were eating into profits that could be better invested in new construction. When longtime tenants had organized to protest the sales, worried about rent increases under new ownership, Ryan had dismissed their concerns as resistance to necessary modernization. The transformation of Mitchell Development Group had been swift and thorough, but it had also been largely invisible to outside observers. The company had continued to grow and prosper, attracting new investors and winning awards for architectural innovation and construction quality. From the outside, it looked like natural business evolution guided by smart leadership. Only someone who had known my grandfather's original vision could see how completely it had been abandoned. Standing in my Portland apartment 5 years later, still holding the phone as Dr. Rodriguez continued describing the award nomination process, I finally understood why those Sunday afternoon conversations with my grandfather had meant so much to me. He had been the only person in my family who had ever seen the work I wanted to do as valuable in its own right, not just as a stepping stone to something more practical or profitable. He had understood instinctively that the communities I dreamed of creating weren't just about housing or economic development, but about human dignity and belonging. He had recognized that my passion for mixed-income neighborhoods and community-centered design wasn't naive idealism, but sophisticated problem-solving that addressed the root causes of urban inequality. Most importantly, he had believed that I had the intelligence and determination to turn those dreams into reality, even when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "Sarah?" Dr. Rodriguez's voice brought me back to the present moment. "Are you still there?" "Yes," I said, wiping away tears I hadn't realized were falling. "I'm here. Tell me what I need to do for this award application." As she outlined the submission requirements and timeline, I found myself thinking about that lost envelope my grandfather had given me in the hospital. Whatever it had contained, his belief in my potential had been gift enough. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to prove that his faith in me had been justified, regardless of whether my own family would ever understand what I was building. 3 months later, I stood in the ballroom of the Seattle Marriott waterfront, wearing a midnight blue dress that I had splurged on for the occasion, watching as 200 of the Pacific Northwest's most influential community development professionals mingled over champagne and hors d'oeuvre. The National Community Development Excellence Awards ceremony was being held in my hometown for the first time in its 15-year history, and the irony wasn't lost on me that I might win the most significant recognition of my career just 20 minutes from where my family lived. Dr. Rodriguez appeared at my elbow, radiant in a burgundy silk dress that complemented her silver hair. "How are you feeling?" she asked, though her knowing smile suggested she already understood the complexity of emotions swirling through me. The nomination process had been rigorous, requiring detailed documentation of my Portland projects, letters of recommendation from community partners, and a presentation to the National Selection Committee that had taken place via video conference 3 weeks earlier. Surreal, I admitted, accepting a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. 2 years ago, I couldn't get my own family to listen to a 5-minute explanation of what I do for a living. Tonight, I might receive a national award for doing exactly that work. The evening had already been emotionally overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. During the cocktail hour, I had been approached by dozens of colleagues and community leaders who knew my work, many of whom had traveled from across the country to attend the ceremony. A housing director from Denver had thanked me for the innovative financing model I had developed for the Portland project, which her organization was now adapting for their own community. A city planner from Minneapolis had described how my approach to community engagement was reshaping their neighborhood revitalization efforts. Most moving had been the conversation with Maria Santos, a young mother who had driven up from Portland specifically to attend the ceremony. Maria had been one of the first residents to move into the affordable housing units I had helped develop in the Jade District, and she had brought her 8-year-old daughter to meet me. "Miss Sarah," the little girl had said, holding up a drawing she had made of their apartment building. "Mama says you helped us find our home." That drawing was now tucked into my purse, worth more to me than any trophy could ever be. But throughout the evening, I had found myself glancing toward the entrance, wondering if my family would appear. I had sent them an invitation 3 weeks ago, along with a brief explanation of what the award represented and why it mattered to me. The response had been typically mixed. My mother had called to say how proud she was, though her tone suggested she still didn't quite understand what community development entailed. Ryan had sent a perfunctory text message congratulating me and explaining that he had a client dinner conflict. My father hadn't responded at all. The Master of Ceremonies, a respected urban planning professor from the University of California, Berkeley, had just taken the stage to begin the formal program when I noticed a stir near the ballroom entrance. Hotel staff were checking credentials more carefully than usual, and there seemed to be some kind of delay with several guests who had just arrived. I was trying to see what was causing the commotion when Dr. Rodriguez touched my arm and nodded toward the back of the room. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I think you should look behind you." I turned and felt my breath catch in my throat. My parents had just entered the ballroom, both dressed in formal evening wear that suggested they had taken this occasion seriously. My mother wore an elegant black dress I had never seen before, and my father was in a tuxedo that looked like it had been tailored specifically for tonight. But what stopped me completely was the man walking beside them, a distinguished gentleman in his 70s, whom I recognized immediately despite not having seen him in over 5 years. James Hartford had been my grandfather's attorney for more than 30 years, handling everything from business contracts to estate planning, with the kind of old-school professionalism that was becoming increasingly rare. He was also the man who had read my grandfather's will to the family after the funeral, a proceeding that had been straightforward and unsurprising. The bulk of the estate had gone to my father, with smaller bequests to my mother, Ryan, and me. There had been no dramatic revelations or hidden surprises, just the orderly transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. Seeing him here tonight, accompanying my parents to an event they had never shown interest in before, created a knot of confusion in my stomach that I couldn't begin to untangle. Mr. Hartford caught my eye across the crowded ballroom and offered a small nod of acknowledgement, but his expression was unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a professor emeritus. The Master of Ceremonies had begun his opening remarks, explaining the history and significance of the National Community Development Excellence Award, but I found it impossible to concentrate on his words. My parents had taken seats at a table near the back of the room, with Mr. Hartford settling beside them like he belonged there. The three of them engaged in quiet conversation, occasionally glancing in my direction, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening that I didn't understand. Dr. Rodriguez seemed to sense my distraction and leaned closer to whisper, "Focus on tonight, Sarah. Whatever brought them here, this moment belongs to you." She was right, of course, but the unexpected presence of my grandfather's attorney had stirred up memories and emotions I thought I had processed years ago. There had been something about my grandfather's final weeks that had never quite made sense to me, loose ends that I had attributed to the confusion and grief of losing someone so central to my sense of identity. The Master of Ceremonies was now introducing the three finalists for this year's award, and I forced myself to pay attention as he described the innovative work being done by community development professionals across the country. The first finalist was a woman from Atlanta who had transformed a struggling neighborhood by creating a network of community-owned businesses that provided both economic opportunity and social cohesion. The second was a man from Phoenix who had developed a revolutionary approach to affordable housing that incorporated renewable energy and urban agriculture. When my name was called, the applause was warm and sustained, and I felt a genuine surge of pride as the Master of Ceremonies described the Portland project in terms that would have made my grandfather beam with recognition. Sarah Mitchell has demonstrated that community development can honor existing cultural identity while creating new economic opportunities, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. Her work in Portland's Jade District has become a national model for how development can strengthen communities rather than displacing them. The presentation that followed included photographs of the housing complex I had helped create, images that showed families moving into homes they could afford, children playing in courtyards designed for safety and community building, elderly residents gathering in common spaces that honored the neighborhood's Asian cultural heritage. But what moved me most were the testimonials from residents themselves, including a video message from Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and had been terrified that gentrification would force her to leave the community where she had raised her children and buried her husband. "Before Miss Sarah's project," Mrs. Chen said in accented but clear English, "I was afraid every day that I would lose my home. Now I know my neighbors, and they know me. We look out for each other. This is what community should be." Her words hung in the air as the video ended, and I could see people throughout the ballroom wiping away tears. When the Master of Ceremonies announced that I had won the award, the standing ovation that followed felt like vindication. For every Sunday afternoon conversation I had shared with my grandfather, every late night I had spent reviewing community impact studies, every time I had chosen meaning over money in my career decisions. As I walked to the stage to accept the crystal trophy, I caught sight of my parents at their table. My mother was applauding enthusiastically, and my father was standing with the rest of the audience, his expression serious but not disapproving. The acceptance speech I had prepared focused on the importance of centering community voices in development decisions. But standing at the podium looking out at an audience that included people whose lives had been directly impacted by my work, I found myself thinking about my grandfather and the envelope he had given me in the hospital that I had never been able to find. "This award doesn't belong to me alone," I began, my voice steadier than I had expected. "It belongs to every resident who trusted me with their vision for their neighborhood, every community partner who shared their expertise, and every person who believes that where we live should reflect who we are and who we hope to become." The reception following the ceremony was a blur of congratulations and business cards, photographs with colleagues and community partners, conversations about replicating the Portland model in other cities. But throughout it all, I remained aware of my parents and Mr. Hartford, who had stayed at their table even as other guests mingled throughout the ballroom. They seemed to be waiting for something, and when the crowd finally began to thin and I had fulfilled my obligations to speak with reporters and fellow award recipients, Mr. Hartford approached me directly. "Sarah," he said, extending his hand with the kind of formal courtesy that belonged to an earlier generation, "congratulations on this well-deserved recognition. Your grandfather would have been immensely proud. There was something in his voice, a weight that suggested this wasn't merely a social pleasantry, and I felt that familiar knot of confusion tightening in my stomach again. "Thank you, Mr. Hartford," I replied, shaking his hand while trying to read the expression behind his glasses. "I have to admit I'm surprised to see you here tonight. It's been years since we've crossed paths." He smiled, an expression that held both warmth and anticipation. "Actually, Sarah, that's precisely why I'm here. I have something that belongs to you. Something your grandfather left specific instructions about." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope that looked remarkably similar to the one my grandfather had given me in the hospital, the one I had lost during the chaos following his death. "I don't understand," I said, accepting the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. "Grandfather's will was read years ago. Everything was settled." "The will, yes," Mr. Hartford confirmed, glancing toward my parents who had now joined us. "But this is something different. Your grandfather prepared this separately, with very specific instructions about when it should be delivered to you." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "He stipulated that you should receive this only after you had achieved recognition for work that honored his original vision for community development." Tonight seemed like the appropriate time. I looked at the envelope in my hands, noting that it was sealed and marked with my name in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. My parents stood on either side of me, their expressions suggesting they knew more about this situation than I did, and I realized that whatever was inside this envelope had the potential to change everything I thought I understood about my family dynamics. "Should I open it now?" I asked, though part of me was afraid of what I might find. The ballroom was nearly empty now, with only a few staff members clearing tables and Dr. Rodriguez waiting discreetly near the exit to give me privacy for whatever was happening. "I think that would be appropriate," Mr. Hartford said gently. "Your grandfather was very specific about wanting you to read this in the presence of your parents." With fingers that felt clumsy and uncertain, I carefully opened the envelope and withdrew several documents. The first was a letter in my grandfather's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. The second appeared to be some kind of legal document, and the third was a bank statement that showed numbers large enough to make me feel dizzy. I began reading the letter aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, it means you have achieved something I always knew you would achieve. You have found a way to honor the true purpose of development work, which is to strengthen communities rather than simply extract profit from them." The letter went on to explain that my grandfather had been quietly setting aside money for years, creating a separate trust fund that was specifically designated for community development projects that aligned with his original vision for Mitchell Development Group. The amount was staggering, $2 million, carefully invested and grown over the past decade, waiting for the right person to use it responsibly. "The business your father inherited is important," the letter continued, "but it is not the only legacy I want to leave. I believe you will use this money to create the kind of communities I dreamed of when I started this company. Communities where everyone has a place and no one is left behind. The only condition I place on this gift is that you use it to continue the work that makes you proud to carry the Mitchell name." By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face and I could see that my mother was crying as well. My father's expression was complex, a mixture of surprise, respect, and what might have been regret. Mr. Hartford waited patiently while I processed the magnitude of what my grandfather had done, not just the financial gift, but the recognition it represented. "He knew," I said finally, looking up at my parents. "He knew exactly what I was trying to build, and he found a way to support it even after he was gone." My father cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried a humility I had never heard from him before. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. Your mother and I have spent too many years focused on the wrong metrics for success. Tonight, seeing you receive this recognition, reading your grandfather's words, I realize we failed to understand that you weren't rejecting our family's legacy. You were trying to preserve the best part of it." The conversation that followed was the most honest one we had shared in years. My parents explained that Mr. Hartford had contacted them weeks ago, after learning about my award nomination, to discuss the terms of my grandfather's trust. They had initially been skeptical about attending the ceremony, still not fully understanding the significance of what I had accomplished, but Mr. Hartford had insisted that they needed to see my work in context to appreciate its value. When we walked into this room tonight and saw all these people who know and respect your work, my mother said, reaching over to squeeze my hand, we realized how much we had missed, how much we had dismissed without ever trying to understand. Ryan appeared at our table just as the conversation was reaching its most emotional point, having left his client dinner early when our mother texted him about the evening's revelations. His reaction to learning about the trust fund was complicated, cycling through surprise, confusion, and finally a grudging respect that felt more genuine than any praise he had offered me in years. $2 million, he said, shaking his head slowly. Grandpa saved $2 million specifically for your community development work. I had no idea he was even paying attention to what you were doing. He was always paying attention, I replied, thinking about those Sunday afternoon conversations and the way my grandfather had listened to my ideas with the kind of focus that made me feel like my thoughts mattered. He just understood something the rest of us took longer to figure out. Community development isn't separate from business success. It's the foundation that makes sustainable success possible. The drive back to Portland that night was entirely different from the drive I had made 3 months earlier after my father's birthday dinner. Instead of silence and anger, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the award or the money, and everything to do with finally understanding my place in my family's story. My grandfather's trust fund would allow me to expand my work in ways I had never imagined possible, but more importantly, his letter had given me something I had been searching for since childhood. Proof that someone in my family had always believed in the value of what I was trying to build. The Portland skyline appeared in my windshield just as the sun was beginning to rise over the Cascade Mountains, painting the city in shades of gold and pink that made even the industrial areas look beautiful. I thought about the families sleeping in homes I had helped create, the small businesses preparing to open in spaces I had helped design, the community center where children would gather after school in a few hours to work on homework and dream about their futures. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Rodriguez. Proud of you, my dear. Your grandfather chose well. Another message appeared from Maria Santos. Rosie wants to know if you'll come to her school to talk about building communities. She says she wants to do what you do when she grows up. I pulled into my parking spot outside my Pearl District apartment and sat for a moment in the quiet of early morning, holding my grandfather's letter in one hand and the Crystal Award in the other. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely aligned with who I was and what I was building. The work would continue, expanded now by resources I had never expected but guided by the same principles that had always driven me. That everyone deserved a place to belong, that communities were stronger when they included everyone, and that the true measure of development success wasn't profit margins, but human flourishing. The girl who had sat invisible at family dinners was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth, didn't depend on anyone else's recognition. But tonight had proven that sometimes, if you're patient enough and strong enough to keep building something meaningful, recognition finds you anyway. And sometimes, the people who matter most have been watching and believing all along, even when they never figured out how to say so while they were still alive to hear your thanks. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.